You used to be able to sit down and just work. No phone, no distractions, just you and the task. And now you open your laptop, and within 4 minutes, you're watching a video about how otters hold hands while they sleep. Something changed. And it wasn't your willpower. It wasn't your discipline. It was your brain. And there's a very specific biological reason for why this is happening to almost every single person right now. Here's what nobody is telling you. The inability to focus that you're experiencing, that restless, scattered, can't sit still feeling, that's not a character flaw. That's not laziness. That is a nervous system that has been literally rewired by the environment you've been living in. And once you understand the mechanism behind it, you can actually do something about it. So let's get into the neuroscience. Your brain runs on a chemical called dopamine. Now, most people hear dopamine and they think pleasure. Like you get dopamine when something feels good. But that's actually not quite right. Dopamine is not the pleasure chemical. Dopamine is the motivation and pursuit chemical. It's the thing that makes you want to go after something. The craving, the drive, the hunger. That's dopamine. And right now, your dopamine system is completely out of calibration. Here's how that happened. Every time you pick up your phone and scroll, every time you check a notification, every time you click on something interesting, your brain releases a small hit of dopamine, not a huge one, a small one. And that's actually what makes it dangerous. Because when the rewards are small and unpredictable, sometimes interesting, sometimes boring, your brain starts releasing dopamine, not when the reward arrives, but in anticipation of the reward. You're not scrolling because it feels good. You're scrolling because your brain has learned that it might feel good. That uncertainty is the trap. That's the slot machine mechanic that's running inside your nervous system right now. And here's where the focus problem comes in directly. When your dopamine baseline, meaning the resting level of dopamine in your system, when that gets pushed up artificially high by constant stimulation, your brain compensates by downregulating its dopamine receptors. It reduces the number of docking stations for dopamine because it's trying to maintain balance. The technical term for this is receptor downregulation. And what that means for you in practical terms is that your threshold for what feels interesting, what feels engaging, what feels worth paying attention to, that threshold goes way up. Normal tasks stop feeling stimulating enough. A book feels slow. A conversation feels boring. Even work you used to enjoy starts feeling kind of flat and uninteresting. You're not broken. Your baseline has just been jacked up by overstimulation, and now the ordinary stuff can't compete. Think about it this way, and this is important, so stay with me here. Imagine you've been eating nothing but extremely spicy food for months. Sriracha on everything, jalapenos, ghost peppers, every single meal. And then someone hands you a plate of regular pasta. It's not that the pasta is bad, it's that your palate has been conditioned to expect intensity, and now mild just registers as nothing. That's exactly what's happening with your attentional system. You've been feeding your brain a constant stream of high intensity, high novelty stimulation. Social media, short form video, news alerts, constant context switching, and now sitting with a single task for 20 minutes feels almost physically uncomfortable. Now let me explain the neurological side of this more precisely, because this is where it gets really interesting. Focus, real, deep, sustained focus, is primarily governed by a region of the brain called the prefrontal cortex. This is the front part of your brain, right behind your forehead. It's responsible for what neuroscientists call executive function, your ability to hold a goal in mind, suppress distractions, sequence actions, and stay on task. The prefrontal cortex is essentially the CEO of your brain, and it requires a very specific neurochemical environment to do its job well. Specifically, it needs the right levels of norepinephrine and dopamine in the right ratio to function properly. When those levels are off and they go off pretty quickly when you're living a high stimulation lifestyle, the prefrontal cortex essentially goes offline. Not completely, but it loses authority. The more reactive, more impulsive parts of your brain start running the show. Your amygdala, which is your threat detection and emotional reactivity center, starts having more influence over your behavior. And suddenly, instead of working on the thing you plan to work on, you're reacting to whatever stimulus just appeared in your environment. An email, a sound, a thought. You're no longer driving the car. You're just being bounced around by whatever happens to show up. And here's the part that most people completely miss. The act of task switching itself is damaging your focus capacity. Every time you shift your attention from one thing to another, from your work to your phone, from your phone to a conversation, from a conversation back to your work, there's a neurological cost. Researchers call it attention residue. When you switch tasks, part of your brain stays stuck on the previous task for several minutes. You're not fully present on the new thing. You're operating with fragmented attention without even realizing it. And if you're doing this dozens of times per hour, which most people are, you are never, not once during your entire workday, operating at full cognitive capacity. You're always split, always partial. And that feeling of mental exhaustion you get at the end of a day where you feel like you worked hard but got nothing done, that's why. Fragmented attention is cognitively expensive, and you've been spending that currency all day without noticing. Now, here's a question worth sitting with for a second. When was the last time you were genuinely bored? Like actually bored with nothing to look at and nothing to do? Because if you can't remember, that's a data point. Real boredom, the kind where you're sitting there with your thoughts and there's no stimulation available, is actually a neurologically productive state. When your brain is understimulated, it activates what's called the default mode network. This is a network of brain regions that becomes active when you're not focused on external tasks. And it is absolutely critical for creativity, for problem solving, for consolidating memories, for making connections between ideas. The shower thoughts, the sudden insight you get while walking. That's your default mode network running. But if you never let yourself be bored, if there's always a screen, always a podcast, always something filling the silence, you are starving that network. You are cutting off one of the most important cognitive processes you have. So what do you actually do about this? Because knowing the mechanism is useful, but if it doesn't change anything, it's just interesting trivia. So let's talk about what actually works based on what the neuroscience supports. The first thing, and this is probably the most high leverage intervention you can make, is to aggressively manage your dopamine environment in the first hour after you wake up. The reason this window matters so much is that when you wake up, your cortisol is naturally spiking. Cortisol in the morning is not a bad thing. It's a wake signal. It mobilizes your system. It prepares you for action. And if you pair that morning cortisol spike with high dopamine, high stimulation inputs, checking your phone, scrolling through social media, watching news, you are training your brain's reward system to expect that kind of stimulation first thing. You are setting the calibration for your entire dopamine baseline for that day. And once that baseline gets set high in the morning, everything that follows, including your actual work, is going to feel comparatively flat. Protect that first hour. Not checking your phone in the first hour after waking up sounds almost insultingly simple, but the neurological impact of it is substantial, and it's been demonstrated in research. What you're doing is allowing your dopamine system to come online gradually without being immediately blasted with artificial stimulation. You're letting your baseline stay low. And that makes everything that comes after more engaging by comparison. The second major lever, and this one has an enormous body of research behind it, is deliberate, structured exposure to low stimulation states. What that means practically is that you need to practice doing one thing at a time with no secondary stimulation for progressively longer periods. This is uncomfortable at first, really uncomfortable actually, because your nervous system has been conditioned to expect constant input, and when it doesn't get it, it generates something that feels almost like anxiety. That restlessness you feel when you try to sit and focus, that's withdrawal. That is your brain asking for the stimulation it's been trained to expect. And the only way through it is to sit with that discomfort and not give your brain what it's asking for. Not because you're trying to be disciplined, but because every time you do it, you're slightly recalibrating your reward system. You're lowering the threshold back down. You're teaching your brain that the ordinary can be interesting again. Start with intervals. You don't need to go from scattered attention to 4-hour deep work sessions overnight. That's not how neuroplasticity works. What you need is progressive loading, the same principle that applies to building physical strength. Start with 90 seconds of focused, single-task work with no phone, no other tabs, no secondary inputs, just you and the task. When the discomfort hits, stay with it. Let it peak and come down. Then slowly extend those intervals over days and weeks. 20 minutes, 40 minutes, 90 minutes. The brain adapts, the discomfort decreases, the focus capacity rebuilds. But you have to be consistent because this is a use it or lose it system. The third piece is sleep. And I know that sounds obvious, but the mechanism here is not obvious at all, and it matters for focus specifically. During sleep, specifically during deep non-REM sleep, your brain runs a kind of cellular maintenance process. Metabolic waste products that accumulate in your brain during waking hours, including a protein called amyloid beta, get cleared out through the glymphatic system, which is essentially a drainage network in your brain that becomes active during sleep. When you're not getting enough deep sleep or when your sleep quality is poor, that clearance process doesn't complete. And the result is a kind of neurological fog the next day that is not simply tiredness. It is actual impairment of prefrontal cortex function, the exact region that controls your ability to focus, suppress distractions, and maintain attention. You cannot out-discipline bad sleep. You cannot caffeinate your way past it. The biological debt accumulates, and it shows up directly in your attentional capacity. There's also something very specific happening with dopamine receptors during sleep. Research has shown that sleep deprivation, even moderate sleep restriction like getting 6 hours instead of 8, significantly reduces dopamine receptor availability, meaning even if you have dopamine present in your system, your brain has fewer receptors to respond to it. You feel unmotivated, foggy, scattered, and irritable. And then you reach for your phone to feel something, and the cycle deepens. Sleep is the foundation that everything else sits on. Now let's talk about something that doesn't get nearly enough attention in conversations about focus, and that's the role of the visual system. Your eyes are not just passive receivers of light. They are directly connected to your arousal state through a pathway that involves the locus coeruleus, a small nucleus in the brainstem that is one of the primary sources of norepinephrine in the brain. When your visual attention is scattered, when you're looking around rapidly, shifting gaze, switching between multiple screens, that actually increases your overall state of neural arousal and makes sustained focus harder. Conversely, when you narrow your visual focus, when you converge your gaze on a single point and hold it there, that activates a part of your visual system that downregulates arousal and makes it neurologically easier to sustain attention. This is why staring at a single point, not a screen, but a physical point in your environment for 30 to 60 seconds before you begin a focused work session can actually prime your visual and attentional systems for the work that follows. It sounds almost too simple to be real, but the underlying neuroscience is solid. You're essentially using the connection between your visual system and your arousal state to intentionally bring yourself into a lower, more focused neural state before you start. It's a legitimate on-ramp into focus, and most people have never heard of it. Let's also talk about what's happening in your body when you sit down to do focused work, because this is often the missing piece. Your nervous system has two primary operating modes: the sympathetic mode, which is your activated fight or flight state, and the parasympathetic mode, which is your rest and digest, calm, and connected state. Optimal focus actually sits at a very specific point on that spectrum, not too calm. If you're too relaxed, you lose alertness and drift, not too activated. If you're too stressed or anxious, the prefrontal cortex goes offline and you can't sustain attention. You need a kind of calm alertness, and your breathing directly controls which side of that spectrum you're on through its effect on the autonomic nervous system. Specifically, your exhales activate the parasympathetic system, and your inhales activate the sympathetic system. This means that the ratio of your inhale to exhale duration directly influences your arousal state. Longer exhales relative to inhales move you toward calm. Shorter exhales relative to inhales move you toward activation. If you're too activated before a focus session, anxious, scattered, mind racing, extending your exhales, making them longer than your inhales, can bring you to a better baseline for focused work within just a few minutes. This is not a metaphor. This is the vagus nerve responding to your breathing pattern and adjusting your heart rate and neural state accordingly. You have a direct lever on your nervous system through your breath, and most people are not using it. And here's something worth understanding about caffeine, because almost everyone who's struggling with focus is also using caffeine heavily. And there's an important relationship between the two. Caffeine works by blocking adenosine receptors. Adenosine is the sleepiness molecule. It builds up in your brain over the course of the day, and the more of it that accumulates, the sleepier you feel. Caffeine doesn't eliminate that buildup. It just blocks your ability to sense it. So the fatigue is still there. You just can't feel it. And when the caffeine wears off, all that adenosine floods back in and you crash. This is normal. But there's a specific timing issue that most people are making that's working directly against their focus capacity. When you consume caffeine immediately upon waking, you're blocking adenosine receptors before your adenosine has had a chance to fully clear from the previous day. Your brain clears adenosine during sleep, but that process takes a while, typically 90 minutes to 2 hours after waking up for full clearance. If you drink coffee the moment you wake up, you're blocking receptors that don't have much adenosine in them yet. And then when the caffeine clears, a few hours later, the adenosine that's been building up during the day hits you much harder. That mid-afternoon crash is in large part a consequence of the timing of your morning caffeine. Delaying your first caffeine intake by 90 to 120 minutes after waking allows your adenosine to clear naturally first, and then you're using caffeine on top of a clean baseline, which results in a more sustained alert state and a less severe crash later in the day. Now let's zoom out and look at the bigger picture, because there's a cultural dimension to this that's worth acknowledging. You're not struggling with focus because you're weak. You are struggling with focus because you are living inside an attention economy that is specifically, deliberately, and very skillfully engineered to fragment your attention. Every notification, every autoplay, every infinite scroll, every algorithmic feed, these are not neutral features. They are designed by teams of engineers and behavioral scientists whose explicit job is to maximize the amount of time you spend engaged with a platform. They are very good at their jobs. The tools they're using, variable reward schedules, social validation loops, novelty triggers, these are the same mechanisms that make gambling addictive. You are not up against your own laziness. You are up against a multi-billion-dollar industry that is playing the neuroscience game at a level of sophistication most people don't fully appreciate. Understanding that doesn't make it easier to put your phone down necessarily, but it does change the framing. When you choose to protect your attention, you are not just making a productivity decision. You are making a decision about who gets to direct your cognitive resources, you or someone else's algorithm. That's a different kind of motivation than just trying to be more disciplined, and it's a more durable one. And this brings us to what might be the single most important concept in this entire conversation, which is the idea that attention is not just a productivity tool. Attention is the mechanism through which you experience your life. Where you place your attention is quite literally where you are. What you focus on is what becomes real and salient to you. And if your attentional system has been colonized by an external feed of algorithmically selected content, then your experience of your own life, your own thoughts, relationships, goals, and presence is being systematically crowded out. This isn't dramatic. It's just the math of finite cognitive bandwidth. You only have so much attention. Where it goes matters. The ability to direct your focus intentionally, to choose what you give your attention to and sustain it there, is one of the highest value capacities a human being has. And it is trainable. It is not fixed. The brain is plastic, and the research on attentional training is clear. Consistent practice of sustained focus, combined with deliberate management of your dopamine environment, produces measurable improvements in prefrontal cortex function, working memory, and the ability to resist distraction. The capacity comes back, the baseline recalibrates, but it requires treating your attention with the same intentionality that you would treat any other system you're trying to improve. So here is what this actually looks like if you implement it. You protect the first hour of your morning from high dopamine stimulation. You introduce deliberate boredom into your days. No phone in line, no podcast on walks, just you and your environment. You use progressive intervals of single tasking to rebuild your focus capacity, starting short and extending over time. You prioritize sleep as a non-negotiable foundation. You use your breathing to prime your nervous system before focused work. You delay caffeine by 90 minutes after waking. And you consciously audit the stimulation inputs in your environment, not as a moral judgment, but as a practical calibration of your own neurological baseline. None of this is complicated, but all of it requires operating against the default conditions of the modern environment, and that is the work. Not because discipline is the point, but because your brain responds to what you consistently expose it to. Feed it fragments, and it will become fragmented. Train it to hold one thing at a time, and it will become capable of depth again. The capacity is in there. The neural architecture is intact. It just needs the right conditions to express itself. And those conditions are more within your control than most people realize.